everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get started. This is going to be our Social 205 religion, family, and sexuality. And we're specifically going to be talking about really three of our major worldly religions. And then we're going to talk about how those impact or view sexuality and how those impact the LGBTQ plus community. And then at the end, we'll get into LGBTQ plus families themselves. And then on another lecture, which is already linked in there, it will cover the gay and trans youth homelessness. And that lecture is also in another class. And so the slide will look different, but it has the same information, but I went ahead and put it on here as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Really, we want to talk about why we need to talk about religion. Religion is one of those hot button topics, right? It's a topic that people stay clear from. It's a topic that brings and holds great emotion because people hold their faith very dear to them. They hold their religious ideologies, their beliefs, and those become a very big part of who they are. And in transit, they become a very big part of what they believe is right, what they believe is wrong, what they believe should or should not happen, what they believe policy and government should be, and all of these things are intertwined. And so it becomes very hard to have a conversation about religious persecution, about religious injustice with those who are very, very inclined to their own faith. So what I want to talk about real quick before we get started is really having the ability to think about ourselves, think about our own religion, and critically reflect how those things impact others and even ourselves possibly, depending on our own social statuses and the history of them from a sociological perspective. So when we do this, we're not looking at this as, is this religion right or wrong? We're looking at this as, how does this affect the social system? How does it impact society? How does it impact those in society? And how is it historically impacted society itself? So we're looking at this through a lens of reflection. We're looking at this through a lens of different perspectives, so that we're not just having a conversation about my faith is better than your faith is better than this faith is better than this faith. That's not what we're doing here. And so I want to start out this conversation by saying that we really need to be respectful and we really need to be open when we're having these conversations, because these are the kind of conversations that need to be happening. So your book starts off with this Uganda example, and it talks about the ways in which it's a good representation of a couple things. It's a good representation of how colonialization shaped and molded our religious systems, and how with very European-centered countries that were based off of Christianity, when they molded and spread throughout the world, they took with them the ability for indigenous people to really practice the things that they were already practicing. It annihilated, shaped, molded, and deteriorated a lot of indigenous religious ideas and a lot of issues. On top of that, now we bring a lot of missions into areas that can need help or having some societal unrest. And what can end up happening as it can create and mold and shape a different kind of unrest or add to the unrest in ways that can be very harmful, can be very violent, can be very problematic. And so your Uganda example at the beginning of the book was really just talking about how religion outside forces can impact religion, which can then impact society in very harmful ways, especially to specific kinds of minority representations. Again, sociology discusses how religion influences society and how society influences religion. And then it gets into another example sociology does is really talk about how we as individuals interact with each other in religious context. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit as we get into how LGBTQ plus members or how other members of society are reshaping certain religions in order to better fit themselves. And we're going to talk about the three major Abrahamic religions. And by that, they just mean they're monolithic. They come from a particular core framework. And so relatively similar are the Old Testament that is fairly consistent in all three of these religions. There are certain tweaks and there are differences, which we will get into. Christianity being the fact that past that we follow the New Testament that then becomes about Jesus Christ, who becomes the Savior, the Son of God, and part of a Holy Trinity, including the Holy Ghost, that embarks on spiritual deity-ness. But it's based on one God, and then his Son is the Savior. Then you have Judaism, which is the Jewish faith, which really is talking about the fact that they are still out there searching for that Messiah, that Savior, and really following to pass, trying to essentially really work towards all of those Old Testament scriptures that work towards and the Torah to work towards getting to the place where a Messiah would come. And then you have the Islamic faith, which Islam is a broad term that sometimes gets used, and this book specifically is being used to describe Muslim faiths. However, Islam, much like Christianity, involves a wide bracketed and a very nuanced version of what religion is. And so just like when you talk about Christianity, you can break it up into Catholic, Protestant, which can then be broken up into a bajillion different subsets of Protestant ideology, including Methodist, Baptist, right? Like, so the same can happen within the Islamic faiths, and Muslim can mean very different things. And we're going to talk about that in different geological regions. It also can mean different things depending on the societal context, the war-torn context, the political context. All of those things can shape and mold that. However, its general text is the Quran, and it specifically leans towards Muhammad as being he's not a Messiah, but he is he's heavily influenced and heavily spiritual in the same way that it's not quite the same. In a similar context that Christ would. So he essentially is not the Messiah, but he came down he was there to emote God's will, and God spoke to him directly to specifically carry out another kind or another subset of text and another subset of ideas in which that they follow as well. And we'll get into kind of how that plays off in society. Just for a perspective, where our major religions are and how they kind of divvy up. So you have your map on the right-hand side, which is going to show kind of the 6 major religious subsets that are within the different spaces. It gets a little more, the graphic on the left gets a little more in detail to specific countries and what the faith looks like, or the mock-up of those faiths looks like. And if you look at United States, it's predominantly Christian. However, there is a good subset of something of the others, and we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit too. Mind you, this is not all religions. There are a lot of religious ideologies that are within the worldscape, and that could be a whole nother class. And it was, in fact, an undergrad at a different institution. I took an entire world religions class, an anthropology class, which was very interesting. So again, we're going to talk about, we're going to start here by talking about Christianity. Once we get through Christianity, I'll probably pause and then we'll do the other two because they're not quite as in depth. But Christianity has a lot to say because it is the dominant religion within the United States. However, again, Christianity is a very broad-based, concept that holds a lot of different variations and ideologies within it. There are 2 primary ideologies within the Christian faith that are subsetted within the United States, and that's Catholic and Protestant. But again, Protestant then gets broken up into multiple different kinds of religious ideologies. So including, not to but varying all the way from Mormon to Southern Baptist to Methodist. So there's a large bracketing within that Protestant subset, and even non-denominational Christians fit into the Protestant category. There's many disagreements among all these subsets about the Bible and how to interpret it and or what goes in it. Now, a reminder for those of you who don't know, or who are maybe not as religious, the Christian Bible was determined, changes depending on, it has very different variants depending on what particular form of Christianity you subscribe to. So the Christian Bible that originated, and the one that is the still followed in most Catholic ideologies or Roman Catholic ideologies, was decided by a large subset of texts that were decided in the Nicene Creed. I know all this because I was raised very Catholic and studied a lot in that subset. I no longer ascribe to that. However, I do have a wealth of information about that particular religious subset. At any rate, essentially, popes sat and major deacons got together and decided what would be in that specific Bible, what studies and teachings had progressed, and they did that based on where society was at the time. And so there were subsets that, and Bibles and or specific texts that were left out that prior to that might have been used within religious frameworks or within sermons or what have you, prior to writing all of this down and getting it written down into the famous Gutenberg's Bible, which again is one of the first major publications that ever happened across multiple languages and across multiple and formatting multiple copies. So it holds some historic significance in that way. But a reminder that, again, within some of these other subsects, you also have other books, you also have other chapters, other inserts. And so the Christian Bible itself has many variations depending on what particular brand of Christianity that you subscribe to. Again, Christian is the primary religion, and 65% of the U.S. population define themselves as Christian in some way or another, and as of 2019. Now, that's considerably down compared to where it was in other periods in the United States, which we'll get into later. Within Christianity, there's a lot of gendered language within the Bible. There's a lot of gendered-based violence and ownership of women within the Bible. So women become, in multiple of the stories, they become a source of violence that has been done to them. They also become a source of ownership, you know, the father giving away his daughter. You have a lot of things that happen to wives or spouses to evoke the wrath of any kind of particular opponent or what have you. And there's lots of gendered notions of families and societal roles within Christianity. Especially for women, virginity, marriage, and motherhood are explicitly ascribed to be achievements. They're ascribed to be something that you have to do. Una, shh. And so they become the pinnacle of what women are. So they are virgins until they're married, and then they are specifically there for motherhood. They're there for nurturing the children. Their role is subservient to the males that are within that household. And it's very much reflected in the lack of women that are allowed in church leadership. Now, again, depending on your variant of Christianity, that will expand or limit your possibilities as a woman to be in a role of leadership, and what that leadership can look like and what jobs you can facilitate in the form of catechism. Sexuality in women in these teachings is very restricted, right? So you're going to be considered the gatekeeper. You're going to be considered the one that is like lustful, and or like you're going to be walking that weird fine line of being the temptress, but also you have to be the virgin. And so this idea of what women's sexuality is really, really polarized. So like you have very opposite ends of the spectrum, and somehow women are supposed to walk that or embody that. And it becomes very problematic when they talk about, especially when you talk about violence within the church, or when you talk about interpersonal violence happening to people and those women coming to the church as a form of or a resource for shelter and to get away from harm. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to fix the marriage as opposed to trying to protect someone from having violence done to them. Women's sexuality is generally linked to reproduction, but most Catholics do not actually follow these ideas that there's no sex before marriage, that women have to be virgins, that it is specifically only for reproduction, that you can't use birth control, blah, 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 right? Okay. Most Catholics at this juncture in history are not following that. Now you have a specific subset of the Roman Catholic faith that is very, very traditional and that will walk these lines. However, the majority of Catholic churches at this point are starting to get more and more lenient on this, including how the Pope speaks about certain things. Now, they're still going to tell you that they want you to wait and have abstinence-only education, and they want you to not do these things. However, they also, most people don't follow them. So there's a disconnect between the how one will show oneself and what they will appear to be, and the like backstage idea of self where what is actually happening happens, right? And then again, links to sexuality, and just talking about that more broadly, priests and clergy have to do a vow of celibacy in order to become a priest. And so their sexuality is thought to be null as in order to have a more of a relationship with God. In Protestant, there's a very much, it varies widely. The ideas of sexuality vary widely, depending on the subtext of Christian that you're, or Protestant that you're thinking about. The sexual purity movement is this evangelical movement that promotes abstinence for young Christians. And so you do have within the Protestant sect, and even within the Catholic sect, also you have these very extremist kind of evangelicals that really work to promote purity, promote abstinence, promote specific kinds of ideas about sexual health and reproduction, promote very much ideas about that stem from out of kind of rape culture, this gatekeeping again idea, that promotes some very shameful and toxic ideologies for women's health. And so there are sects of that. However, especially within the Protestant variations of Christianity, you also end up having the opposite happen, where you have like very much this feminist ideology, this feminist Christianity that comes out of it, that really focuses on reinterpreting and centering women and centering women's empowerment, and allowing, you know, those women's group to have more leadership roles, to have allow women and LGBTQ plus persons to hold leadership roles. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we move forward. There's a lot of political power within the Christian church in the United States, despite being those far right evangelicals being very much the minority within this country to a large degree. They still hold a very large amount of political power, and a lot of their political policies end up becoming the rule of law, despite having a very minority public opinion about it. And so again, when you talk about things like, and this is when you get into polling about things such as abstinence-only education, things of this nature, where really the broad-based spectrum of, or overturning Roe v. Wade's another one, right? So like the broad-based population really works towards and or centered themselves around the idea of upholding Roe, of teaching more fact-based and more extensive sexual education, providing, having places that provide birth control and or contraceptives like condoms and things of that nature accessible, to prevent, unwanted pregnancies and of that nature. So really, the fact that a large portion of the population agrees with these ideas, while yet a specific political entity linked to a specific type of Christian holds a lot of political power, is another example of how religion can intertwine with society. So getting into Christianity and homosexuality. Now, this is a heated debate amongst a whole variety of different Christian sects of a Christianity sects. So in some, especially more traditional views of, so your Southern Baptist, probably your traditional Catholics, your let's see, your traditional Methodists, because they just split on this topic as well. A lot of them will believe that or link homosexuality to sodomy, which is sexual intercourse involving anal or oral copulation, which is often conflated with queer sex, which is not always the case. However, and or some of those things also happen within opposite sex relationships as well. And so really having that equate what those relationships look like and what that sexuality look like has caused problems religiously. Catholics ask for LGBTQ plus members to be abstinent or uphold repressing chastity notions. Now, again, there are different branches of the Catholic faith that are getting a little better about that. However, for every progressive part of a Christian ideology, there is a pushback sect of that same ideology. In 2016, the Pope called for apologies for harassment and discrimination and to love LGBTQ members, but not to change their idea that it is morally wrong, but really to essentially work towards this idea that as long as they're not engaging in these activities and or they repress their sexuality, then they can be a part of the church. This has led to things like praying it away, healing the gays, therapying the gay away within religious frameworks, and conversion therapies, which become incredibly harmful and can be very violent. There are LGBTQ plus clergy within Protestant churches. There's been some splits within religious communities, like, for example, the Methodist Church is just split on the topic. And so you have one topic or one more traditional sect of the Methodist faith where they are not as welcoming or inclusive, and then a sect of the Methodist faith that is inclusive and it even encourages leadership position for LGBTQ plus members. The cultural and historical debate around LGBTQ in the Bible. So a reminder that, again, the Bible and these stories are representative of a specific time and place and culture, and whether you interpret the Bible as factual evidence and or you look at it as a historical text with ideologies, neither of those things outright use the word homosexual or queer or gay or anything remotely close to that particular language. Usually what is cited to talk about homosexuality is a story that involves child molestation and rape, and is a male raping another male. And so that is not consensual, is not the same thing as homosexuality, is not the same as that. And furthermore, if you are looking at this from a historical lens, Jesus would have been around within the Roman and would have been around Roman culture, which very much had a wide understanding of homosexuality, and was very much adamant that homosexuality was a part of culture. And so if there was an issue with this, there would likely have been an outright, or very much could have had an outright conversation about what it is about these specific individuals that is wrong. However, that never appears in the Bible, and that never becomes part of the context, despite its cultural relevance to that time period in which Jesus would have lived and those stories would have been talked about. So that becomes a very, very much a hotly debated topic, and again, fuels part of that conversation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Christianity and religious harm. So Christianity has a long history of religious harm, moving all the way back to the Inquisition, and again, colonization, which really embarked on a world genocide of indigenous cultures and indigenous religions, and used those as a way, and used itself as a way of moralizing the death and destruction of other people as religiously cleansing. And this happened as well within the Nazi movement and its links to Christianity. And so there's a lot of links to Christianity and incredibly heroic, like historically atrocious things. And so that can be a whole nother lecture, and I do that lecture in a different class. So if you're interested in that, I can share that as well. So again, we have kind of that same thing that we were talking about a minute ago, but to talk about real quick, a little bit more in depth, conversion therapy is the idea that there are certain kinds of therapies that can essentially get rid of the queer part of yourself and or specific kind of physical harm, including torture, including rape, including sexual assault, including incredible lengths of violence, can convert you into not being a queer person anymore. Now, there is still, again, conversion therapy is against the law in the states you see in dark blue. The states you see in light blue have laws that are trying to be passed, and or there's certain counties and or cities that do that. So like for Kentucky, for instance, Fayette County, most of the counties in or surrounding Louisville, most of the counties in or surrounding Cincinnati, and I believe Richmond also has one that can that ban conversion therapy. However, there's a good portion of rural Kentucky that is still working to get that passed. And they were working at a state level one not that long ago, but I'm not sure that it passed. But I can get you more information on that if you'd like it. The American Psychiatric Association has specifically condemned conversion therapy, and they have taken measures to make sure that if you practice conversion therapy, that you can lose your license to do psychology or any kind of psychiatric treatment. Conversion therapy and or religious rejection in general can cause a lot of depression and suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause for death amongst those aged 15 to 34. LGBTQ plus are 5 times more likely to attempt that, and 41.8% of non-binary youth attempt suicide at least once. And again, this will tie into kind of that lecture on homelessness. These crises of faith can really impact an individual at a very, very core level, because these are things that you have tied to your identity. Family rejection can do not only mental and emotional harm, but can also do harm in the way of causing homelessness, causing economic instability, can cause those to be put in the foster system that is not always kind either, and or have run-ins with the law, which is equally not as kind to LGBTQ plus members. Pray away the gay is really this idea that you can take away part of yourself if you pray hard enough. There's, again, religion you can find resilience within religion. However, there's more often stigmatization. It can lead to this internalized homophobia, which is this idea of kind of self-hatred, that because that you're not praying hard enough or you're not doing enough, that you can't get rid of this attraction that you have, and or this want to form relationships with other individuals at a very consensual level, or experience love in that way, because you don't want to reject that part of yourself, that you yourself are bad. There can be these ideas that, especially if you're raised in a really religious household, that there's something wrong with you. And that is not the case. However, that internalized homophobia also can lead to outwardly doing harm to other LGBTQ members that you may associate with or that you may have previously associated with as you try to rectify your own faith and your queerness. It can lead to substance abuse. It can also lead to horizontal oppression, which is what I was talking about a minute ago, when an LGBT person discriminates against another LGBT person. This happens a lot with closeted political or religious leaders. Ted Haggard and the Bush administration, within the Bush administration, is a really good example that is in your book, of a political figure who was queer, did not like that he was queer, was actively anti-queer within legislation. You're going to see a lot of, like, there's a lot of that is happening, and you can find that within a good number of severely anti-LGBTQ plus politicians and or leaders, that they either know somebody or are themselves a queer person that they are wanting to rectify that situation. All right, so we're going to get back out here, and we're going to get back in just a minute. We're going to do the other two religions, or well, we're going to talk a little bit more about Christianity. Then we're going to do the other two religions, and then we'll talk about families and call it a day.